Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section, The Seven Seals in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So the section deals with a lot of different topics, but overall it deals with the idea of time and fragility. So let's get started. The Seven Seals, or The Song of Yes and Amen, Section 1. If I be a prophet and full of that prophetic spirit that wanders on high ridges between two seas, wanders between past and future like a heavy cloud, enemy to sultry lowlands and to all that is weary and can neither die nor live, ready for lightning in its dark bosom, and for redeeming beams of light, pregnant with lightning which affirms yes, laugh yes, ready for prophetic lightning flashes. But blessed is he who is thus pregnant, and in truth, he who wants to kindle the light of the future must hang long over the mountains like a heavy storm. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence. Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love. For I love you, O eternity. For I love you, O eternity. So then, for this section, we have a continuation on from the last one, where Zarathustra was having a conversation with life, who is embodied in this great female-like character. And the main thing to take away from that section is that Zarathustra wanted to move away from life into then focus upon eternity. And what was the whole big thing about that, of course, was that move into the eternal return for this section. So for the Seven Seals, then, we have this continual I love you, O eternity, that's going to keep popping up in relation to the eternal return. And then we have all this sort of fantastic imagery that always creeps up as well, where you have the whole discussion about mountains and sultry lowlands and so on. But we have a key thing that comes out of this, and it's that whole relation into yes and affirmation. And it's that little line there, ready for lightning in its dark bosom and for redeeming beams of light, pregnant with lightnings which affirm yes, laugh yes, ready for prophetic lightning flashes. Why is this whole yes so important? Is because Nietzsche sees everything having been focused upon very much the opposite of that. So, no. And what is that no? This thing that we've touched upon in many episodes. It's always that move away from life in the world towards a focus on the soul, death, the afterlife, and hence we have so much criticism against organized religion and the moves into that. And so, again, it touches upon what I highlighted in the last episode as well, about Nietzsche's whole project to reinvigorate humanity and to no longer being this miserable species, because that's ultimately what he sees psychological harm over time, and even in a historical sense of that as well, that's happened to us, is that ultimately we've always had this element of sapping life out of us and making us more docile and making us less passionate, and therefore just making us just really miserable because all the life and all the passion's been taken away from us. And so this whole yes is precisely a yes to humanity and to all that passion and creativity and all the great stuff about humanity, because humanity's been stuck in this whole state of being miserable for so long. Here we have this prophetic statement where he says yes. Yes, precisely for the future and a life affirmation, world affirmation. And we have yes in relation to the eternal return. Why should I not lust after the eternal return? And it's quite an interesting thing, which you'd say, well, why would you want to lust after something like that? Because you would say, well, what is the eternal return? Is that repetition of exactly the same life over again. And it would be either an absolute hell or an absolute joy. And it's that point again that goes back into the other whole half of it. If we're in this whole state of being miserable and focused solely upon death, the afterlife, therefore our entire existence, every single return, would just be that horrible state of always being miserable all the time. And so then it's lusting after that yes, is to say, well, I want to have that sense of positivity, because then we can start living our life for the here and now, start enjoying life in the here and now, and precisely have that relation into the future and start to change our mentality now. So let's move on to the next section then. Section 2. If ever my anger broke graves open, moved boundary stones, and rolled old shattered law tables into deep chasms, if ever my mockery blew away mouldered words, and if I came like a broom to the cross spiders, and as a scouring wind to old sepulchres, if ever I sat rejoicing where old gods lay buried, world-blessing, world-loving, beside the monuments of old world-slanderers. For I love even churches and the graves of gods, if only heaven is looking pure-eyed through their shattered roofs. I like to sit like grass and red poppies on shattered churches. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence? Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman, whom I love. For I love you, O eternity. For I love you, O eternity. And so we have then this fantastic development out of time that's starting to creep out here when we get into section 2. Because we have that relation into churches and gods. And we can go into what Nietzsche's trying to get at here, is that when you have the whole idea of a specific doctrine, whatever one it be from whatever organized religion or gods, these are always in the sense of being absolute. Be it the word of God himself, the word of God or gods, having been through the prophets that came to earth on behalf of them and so on. And then we have all that relation into this is a timeless thing. Gods are pure, metaphysical. The doctrines themselves are pure, flawless things that should be upheld. So we have all this on the one hand, and then we have Nietzsche's point about time on the other. And Nietzsche's point is that with time, ideas precisely crumble. And any God that's upheld to be absolute precisely depends upon specific people in order to worship the God. And so if you take away the people to worship the God or gods, then where is the God anymore? Where is the religion if suddenly Nobody cares about it anymore. It's gone as well. And we could just use past example of ancient Greek gods, in which we can say, well, at one given period in time, people worshipped the Olympian gods of Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, and so on, built temples, made offerings, made sacrifices, all that. But over time, this stuff went away. They're no longer worshipped anymore. So what does that mean to say on a deeper level when we look at organized religion, when we look at gods, is not that they're absolute, not that they're somehow timeless, not that even the doctrines are these pure things, but rather they're all very much fragile, because they could ultimately, over time, just lose their impact and nobody cares about it anymore. And therefore we have that complete dissolution of a specific organized religion. But here we can also just say, well, it doesn't have to be just ancient Greece, but also all the different religious organizations that's happened historically that even we don't know about, because it would take an anthropology basically to go and discover all these little elements and these early civilizations and so on of different religions and different ideas of spiritual entities and gods and so forth. But again, it's like the whole idea of, well, it's all very much a timely thing. It's all dependent upon specific people worshipping these things in the first place. And it's not always going to be like that. So what can we say for this specific section is one of the things we can take away from it is that relation into time. And if only we think about things in relation to time, we then see the fragility of ideas, and specific ideas that are upheld as so grand and so important. But looking at everything in a much grander scale over the course of history and millennia and so on, then we can precisely see these ideas that are upheld to be as so grand and so important and so necessary for us are actually very fragile in the first place. Section 3. If ever a breath of the creative breath has come to me, and a breath of that heavenly necessity that compels even chance to dance in star rounds, if ever I have laughed with the laugh of the creative lightning, which the thunder of the deed, grumbling but obedient, follows, if ever I have played dice with the gods at their table, the earth, so that the earth trembled and broke open, and streams of fire snorted forth, for the earth is a table of the gods, and trembling with creative new words, and the dice throws of the gods. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence? Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love, for I love you, O eternity, for I love you, O eternity. So then, section 3, we have this image of playing dice with the gods, and the earth is basically the board. So what exactly is this all getting at? Is Nietzsche's whole relation into chance, flux, and therefore everything in the world being in a continual state of transformation and change? Why is this so important? Why is there this focus upon the necessity of transformation and change? Because it has a relation back into the way in which philosophy traditionally attempts to work, which is always trying to establish fixed things that are always going to function in such a way that it's going to be absolutely perfect. And one example of that, of course, is Descartes' whole project in Meditations on First Philosophy. Descartes tries to establish a nice philosophical basis where we can reach certainties about things, absolute, concrete certainty, where then that'll have a knock-on effect to how we can gain knowledge in the world. So philosophy always comes first, and then comes everything else after it. Or another way of putting it, philosophy first, metaphysics first, and then the sciences come after it. Here we have precisely the opposite way around of doing things. Because we say, well, if we then affirm chance and novelty, we go back into this whole idea of fragility that's getting built up in this section, because we no longer can have an absolutely pure basis for things, because our knowledge itself would never be absolute. It would never be pure. It would never be free from any skepticism or any doubt. And that's one of the things, of course, that Descartes wants to do, is to try and establish certain truths that can never be called into question. Here we have the complete opposite of that. We do have truths that are always called into question. And why does that happen? Going back into the idea of time, because over time, any truth, regardless of what it is always called into question. And so again, we've had that nice relation into organized religion. Now we have a move in towards knowledge, where we say knowledge then is fragile because all truths are subject to change. And why are they subject to change is because of all that transformation, because of all that chance and all that flux that happens, of course, to our knowledge. It's never a stable thing. And whenever we think of a given thing, then we can precisely say over time our idea of that very much changes. An easy example to think of this is just the way in which cinema works. And over time, expectations change for exactly what we expect to see. And so if you just go back and watch a really early silent films, and where it's in black and white, and where there's no talking whatsoever, if you go really far back and there's not even a plot, you start to see all the things that you want. You start to want color, you start to want a soundtrack, fully orchestrated, you want actors, you want a great plot to get invested in, and all the different things that come into it. And that's precisely a nice, easy example there where we could see expectations change over time, because we have that whole idea of, therefore, our knowledge is something that's not static, not fixed, but is always in continual development. And so, moving into section 4 then, we have this relation into ethics that's then built up. So, continuing on, if ever I have drunk a full draught from that foaming mixing bowl of spice, in which all things are well compounded, if ever my hand has welded the furthest to the nearest, and fire to spirit, and joy to sorrow, and the wickedest to the kindest, if I myself am a grain, that redeeming salt that makes everything mix well together in the bowl. For there is a salt that unites good and evil, and even the most evil is worthy to be a spice, and a last over foaming. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence? Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love, for I love you, O eternity, for I love you, O eternity. And so we have this whole relation then into good and evil and ethics, and this whole idea of mixing things together in a nice big bowl. If you can somehow cook with ingredients and you're mixing them all together. Now, why is this a strange image when you deal with ethics? Is because traditionally within ethics you couldn't mix anything together, because it goes again into this whole idea of purity. And you have absolute good, you have absolute bad, and again, these ideas are meant to be fixed and not meant to change over time. Here again, we have this whole idea of, well, our precisely idea of what good is and what evil is are again subject to change and are precisely not pure absolute things that don't change over time. And an easy example of that, we don't have to go into morality, but rather we can just have the sort of everyday examples of how our ideas of what is good and what's bad change. And of course, the first thing that usually pops into mind is smoking, where you'd have the whole thing in the 50s where smoking was deemed to be a good thing for you, and now we know it's absolutely not, because it causes lung cancer. And we could also have another relation into what we consider good and bad things to eat. You can tell I like to think with my stomach quite a bit as well. So we got a nice little article from eatthis.com, 12 bad foods that are now good, written by Olivia Tarantino, where we'll just go through a couple examples. Number one, everything with fat. Out with the old, it says, all fat makes you fat. In with the new, the right kinds of fat helps increase satiety, maximize your metabolism, protect against heart disease, speed nutrients through your body, and improve your fat soluble vitamin uptake. Number two, eggs. Out with the old again. Egg yolks are high in cholesterol, which means eating them will raise your cholesterol levels, putting you at risk for heart disease. And the new is that new research has found that cholesterol levels in our bodies are impacted by types of fat in our food, not as much from the dietary cholesterol content. So it's again, we can just use the whole really easy everyday examples there to say, well, our ideas which are good and bad are precisely, again, in flux and change over time. And it has that whole lovely relationship into our knowledge, because our knowledge and the whole scientific endeavor into what food groups are good and all that nutritional information then has a knock-on effect to what things are beneficial for us and not within our bodies. Moving on to section 5 then. If I love the sea and all that is sea-like, and love it most when it angrily contradicts me, if that delight in seeking that drives sails towards the undiscovered in me, if a seafarer's delight is in my delight, if ever my rejoicing has cried, the shore has disappeared, now the last fetter falls from me, the boundless roars around me, far out glitter space, and time, well then, come on, old heart. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence. Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love, for I love you, O eternity, for I love you, O eternity. So we have this nice relation back into seafaring that sometimes pops up in previous sections as well. And this whole relation into the sea is precisely in an exploratory manner. For it's a whole metaphor for if you're out in the sea, you're going to go and discover lands that have never been set upon by anybody before. And so we have that whole relation into, therefore, discovering new things and also discovering new things about ourselves at the same time. We get all that from the lines, if that delight in seeking that drives sails towards the undiscovered in me, if a seafarer's delight is in my delight. And we can get from all that, well, what is the delight in the first place is because nothing is fixed, nothing is absolute, and therefore there's that sense of absolute joy and pleasure in just this whole sense of discovery and going out and learning about the world or learning about whatever particularly interests someone as well. There's that whole joy and sense of just learning and discovery. And therefore, there has that lovely knock-on effect is the more deeper you go into something, the more you enjoy. And of course, we can just have a very basic example of that as well. Just trying to learn a musical instrument. We have all that, of course, stumbling and struggling and all those little things that happen at the start. But you continually practice at that musical instrument, and then gradually you discover and learn things about it. And all the fantastic things that then come out of that. And your joy about learning not only the instrument, but also about music at the same time. And then we could apply that to ourselves, where you could say, well, are we static people who are, let's use the example that Nietzsche's got here. Are we people who like to be sat on an island, or do we like to get out on a boat and have a bit of an adventure? So we can say here, well, you can be quite happy on that little island, but at times you're going to need to go out on the boat. And once you do, you're going to discover things, and you're going to discover things about yourself at the same time. So we're not this static thing that's unchanging either over time, but precisely our own ideas and opinions can change in a very much radical way. Is that whole thing of we think what we believe is absolutely unshakable, but then something happens, you read something, and then suddenly, my God, did I really think that? And it's of course only with hindsight. Usually you could look back and go, oh, was really dressing like that when I was a teenager? Was that such a great idea? But of course at the time you think it's absolutely the bee's knees. But all builds up into that whole point that Nietzsche wants to make, is that we have this whole thing about discovering new things, not only in relation to knowledge, but also ourself, and this whole notion of continual change and development that's coming out. So let's go into section 6 then. If my virtue is a dancer's virtue, and if I often leap with both feet in golden emerald rapture, if my wickedness is a laughing wickedness, at home among rose bowers and hedges of lilies, for in laughter all evil is present, but sanctified and absolved through its own happiness. And if it be my Alpha and Omega that everything heavy shall become light, every body a dancer, all spirit a bird, and truly that is my Alpha and Omega. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity, and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence? Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love. For I love you, O eternity. For I love you, O eternity. So section 6 then, we have this whole relation into laughter. And why does it have this whole relation into laughter? Is because laughter is destructive and mocking of past ideas that we have. And a good example of a couple of those is from weburbanist.com, Bizarre Inventions, 15 Idiotic Ideas from the Past. And just a couple of those. One is The Isolator. The Isolator by Hugo Gernsback, a terrifying hood with an attached oxygen mask for when you really, really, really want to be isolated. Outside noises being eliminated, the worker can concentrate with ease upon the subject at hand. So this looks like something that's more like a Halloween costume that puts over somebody's head, and you're meant to breathe through this thing with the oxygen mask attached. And another example here, we have wooden swimsuits. Swimsuits have come a long way since the days when they were long-sleeved wool monstrosities, but this wooden swimsuit invention pictured in Washington State in 1929 wasn't exactly a step forward. I can't imagine how uncomfortable wearing a wooden swimsuit or even wooden trunks would be. So what exactly is Nietzsche getting at with this whole thing to do with laughter? Is because an idea can be upheld as so fantastic, so great, especially by a civilization at a given time period, that everybody thinks it's the absolute bee's knees, as they would say. You can't get any better. And then when people look back upon an idea or an invention, then people laugh at the precise stupidity of it. And so again, it's something that's been touched upon many times in this section so far, is that when we place value upon something in society, we can always build it up to be so grand. But again with time, what does it show? That a grand idea can precisely be incredibly stupid and humorous and worthy of absolute mockery and laughter when you look back at it. Because we've got this lovely relation into weight and making things light. And if it be my alpha and omega that everything heavy shall become light, every body a dancer, all spirit a bird, and truly that is my alpha and omega. Because when we place value upon something, it burdens it. It goes back into that whole idea of the three metamorphoses in the camel. This is the whole camel aspect where you have a great burden placed upon something. What does humor and laughter ultimately do is lift this burden. And so we have a great way to say, well, how can we try to tackle these burdens that's placed upon us? Is humor, because it shows the fragility of precisely those ideas in the first place. And that's what's so great about comedians as well, is that they can take a given structure or a social event and so forth like that, and something that can be so upheld and burdened by society, and then of course they make a joke about something, and then that joke precisely shows the fragility of all that value and burden that's been placed upon it. So therefore, comedy is a very beneficial thing for us because it allows us to reflect upon precisely the fragility of structures themselves and values themselves. Let's go into the last section then. Section 7. If ever I spread out a still sky above myself and flew with my own wings into my own sky, if playing I have swum into deep light distances, and bird wisdom came to my freedom. But thus speaks bird wisdom: behold, there is no above, no below. Fling yourself about, out, back, weightless bird. Sing, speak no more. Are not all words made for the heavy? Do not all words lie to the light? Sing, speak no more. Oh, how should I not lust for eternity and for the wedding ring of rings, the ring of recurrence? Never yet did I find the woman by whom I wanted children, unless it be this woman whom I love. For I love you, O eternity. For I love you, O eternity. Section 7 then builds upon this whole idea of making things light and removing all that burden from things that's been placed with enormous value upon them. And so we have this whole idea of bird wisdom therefore come out in section 7. Once all that weight's been lifted, you then have bird wisdom, as he says. And this is why we have this relation into language that pops up in section 7, where it says, Are not all words made for the heavy? Do not all words lie to the light? Sing, speak no more. Because what's interesting here is this whole relation into language and becoming seduced by words. And that's what exactly we do once we hear great talkers and speeches, read great novels and books, you precisely become seduced by words. But here Nietzsche offers a little bit of the alternative. Sing. Why sing then? And it goes back into the previous section of The Great Longing, where Zarathustra was talking to his soul, and he said to his soul, sing. I bade you to sing, because it's trying to get into the whole aspect there of a creative force and joy that's done precisely without much thought to it whatsoever. And singing doesn't take upon the same sense of burdens and value that words precisely do in that given instance. It's just something pleasant to listen to, basically, we have here, is what it's saying. But at the same time, what does music have is that force of creativity, that people will do things very much in a joyful, creative way, and there's not necessarily much burden and value that's placed upon exactly what they do, but they're creating things precisely because they enjoy it in the first place. And that's the whole point that wraps up this section, to say, well, what should we have is not all this focus upon who can we idolize, what can I hold to my heart precisely and take absolutely word for word, but rather, as we've been developing it out as we go through the book, is Nietzsche trying to have everyone develop who they are as a person, create themselves, and not so much get into this whole rut of wanting everything to be accepted by everyone else, but rather just enjoying the creativity, enjoying precisely what they do without all the external worries about that. So that about wraps it up for this episode, touching upon lots of different topics: chance, affirmation, fragility of our knowledge, fragility of our opinions, fragility of our own sense of who we are, and therefore that lovely relation there at the end into humor as well as creativity coming back again at the end. In the next episode, it'll be a nice summary and going back over part 3 before we get started into part 4. So trying to touch upon some general themes and ideas overall for part 3 as a section. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section The Seven Seals in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. You can tip me a coffee at ko-fi.com/dissectingphilosophy. And lastly, I can be found on Twitter at I am a rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.